Welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. Let us help you escape your mind.
All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 274 tonight. We have a special episode. We are joined by our buddy, Dr. Andrew Gallimore. His new book is out. It's called Reality Switch Technologies. I have a copy right here. Just finished reading it about a month ago. And if you haven't checked out his first book, I highly recommend it. Alien Information Theory. Nice hard book. These books are actually not just well written, but they have tons and tons of cool, there's artwork, there's dialogue, or there's diagrams, there's all sorts of interesting stuff. So check them out. I highly recommend it. You can go to Andrew's website at the bottom, alieninsect.com, and you can buy the book there. You can go on Amazon. But yeah, I highly recommend checking those out. We have done a few episodes with Andrew previously. You can check those episodes down below. We've also done a couple Patreon segments with Andrew as well. So you can check out our Patreon. It's just $2 a month. The LinkTree link is down below. I want to give a special shout out to Aubrey, who created us a new logo. As soon as we're done, I will add the link to his stuff. He is a graphic designer, and he does all sorts of animation and stuff like that. So show Aubrey some love, and if you need anything done in that realm, check him out. What else do we have here? Leah is joining us tonight. Check out at Leah Prime on Twitter. She also has a Substack, and also check out Andrew's Substack. I forgot. Please check out Andrew's Substack. I have the link down below as well. Follow Shane on Twitter, and all the links are down below. If you want to support Mind Escape, we have a LinkTree. Our other podcast, the Roswell UFO Symposium, there's a LinkTree. And yeah, everything's down below. So, but without further ado, welcome back on the show, Andrew. How are you?
Thanks for having me again. I'm pretty decent. Thank you very much. Can't complain.
Yeah. So we were trying to set this up about a month ago, and then the holidays happened and everything, but glad to have you back on. And we're less than a month away from the release of our documentary, which you are actually a large part in, which our documentary is called As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT. The link to the trailer is down below. It will be premiering at the Roswell UFO Expo in March, as well as it will be featured at the Roswell Incident Film Festival in July. But the reason why I got you involved with that is because I wanted to do something that had a little bit of a crossover between the whole DMT psychedelic entity thing and aliens and UFOs. And I think that obviously your first book, Alien Information Theory, is a great speculative guide on how we would make contact with some sort of alien intelligence and the mechanisms that would lead to that, right? So, but I want to talk about your second book that just came out, Reality Switch Technologies, which I actually liked even more because it was a little bit more diverse. You kind of go into more of the different compounds and the mechanisms and everything like that. Was that the goal, is to just expound off of everything you already did with DMT, or what was the background behind that?
Yeah, I think, I've read a lot of books on psychedelics over the years, as you can imagine, and I've also developed, for myself at least, over the last 20 years, I developed kind of a deep kind of understanding of what's going on in the brain. This is kind of important to me, is trying to not just focus on the experience, the phenomenology, which a lot of people try to just focus on that, what actually happens to you, which of course is amazing, right, with DMT. But I'm really interested in trying to get in deep into the brain and actually work out what's actually going on when these simple molecules interact with your nervous system, and they interact with these receptors in the brain. How does that simple molecule protein interaction translate and elicit these remarkable changes in consciousness? So how do you bridge that gap between molecule receptor interactions and changes in the structure and dynamics of your world? And can we develop a kind of a unified model of how that all works in the brain? And I think there's been so much research over the last decade, and built upon research that's been going on for many decades before that, but nobody had really put it all together, so to speak, in a way that a non-scientist could understand. I mean, you can pore over the literature and kind of piece it together yourself, but it took me a decade or two to kind of achieve that. So I wanted a book, and I knew there was kind of a gap in the market. This book didn't exist. That's why I wrote it. A book that you could read and develop a really deep understanding for how these molecules actually work. Everyone knows they interact with the 5-HT2A receptor, right? But very few people can tell you why. When you stimulate that particular receptor subtype, you get these dramatic changes in structure and dynamics of your world model, of your consciousness, of your experience of self and of the world. That's a difficult connection to make, and it involves several levels of organization. You have to think about the fundamental interactions going on at the receptor level. You also need to think about how does this affect the way that neurons behave, right? How does it change the way that neurons communicate with each other, the way that they share information? How does that then relate to the behavior of these large networks of neurons from which your world model, your own personal subjective world is constructed? So that's basically what I tried to do with the book, is look at, first of all, develop this overall model of how your world is constructed. So taking you through all of the fundamental neuroscience, everything you need to understand what's going on, just in your normal waking world, when you're not under the influence of a psychedelic. And once you've kind of established that neurological underpinning, that foundational level of understanding, then you can ask questions like, what happens if we perturb this system using this type of molecule, and this particular pathway? How does your world model change? So this takes us to the classic psychedelics, for example. You're stimulating, you're perturbing this system, this world building machinery, as I refer to it, in a particular way, and it leads to particular types of effects. And then we can also bring in other molecules like ketamine or the tropane alkaloids, and we can perturb, or salvinorin, yes, this world-shattering molecule, reality-shattering, astonishingly psychedelic, powerful, world-switching agent. All of these molecules are unified in that they all perturb this world-building machinery in the brain, but each in their own distinct way. They each approach from a different mechanism, and which is why they have kind of distinct effects. But we can bring them all together as being kind of psychedelic, which is I kind of define as a molecule that alters the structure and dynamics of your world and self model, if you like. So that's basically the idea of the book, is to bring all of that whole story together. So if you read the book, you will, I think, and read it slowly. It's not an easy read, as I'm sure you're aware, but it doesn't require you to be, a scientist. As long as you've got kind of high school biology, or if you're willing to spend a couple of hours Googling a few basic fundamental ideas in biology, then you can understand the book, and you will come away from it, I think, with a really good, deep, and satisfying, hopefully, understanding of what psychedelic molecules do and why they do what they do and why we're so fascinated by what they do.
Yeah, you said you know, you wrote it for the average person. I'm just thinking to myself, I mean, it is, you know, you can get through it, but I think it took me being interested in like, okay, how does the 5-HT2A receptors work in this process of psychedelics, and, you know, the whole serotonergic aspect of it, you know, like it took me a while to get into that but once you are in on psychedelics, I think if you're a curious person, I think you do start to gravitate towards, well, what's happening biologically, and then also what does this mean in terms of like the nature of reality, right? So I think that's
Mm.
the big um the main thing about your book is you try and marry those two things together, which would be I mean, you're not out there preaching some theory of everything, but in the book, like I said, you try and tie in together, okay, you know, we know these compounds some of them are produced in our body. We know how these receptors work. However, this, you know, this idea of mind and experience and everything is very weird and bizarre and does not align with our standard model of physics as a material thing. So, yeah, that's probably what I enjoy most about this is also like the diagrams. And, you know, I think the new one, you go more into like the GABA opioid and all of those different receptors. You mentioned salvinorin, and I think
Yeah.
last time you were on, we went into a whole part about the tropanes and how you think tropanes might induce more of visions of things that aren't there, as opposed to a tryptamine, which is almost just playing off of what we already see. So the tropane thing might be a little different in the sense you might actually be seeing things that aren't there, which we can talk
Yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. Tropanes, they tend to elicit what's called true hallucinations, which are kind of indistinguishable. So with tryptamine induced visions, hallucinations probably isn't even the right word. You're normally very much aware that what you're seeing isn't not necessarily not real, but isn't normal, so to speak. You maintain insight, to use psychiatric parlance, and you're fully aware that what you're seeing is not what you normally expect to see when you're awake. The visions kind of announce themselves. As no one's going to smoke DMT and not realize that they're having a psychedelic experience, right? But with the tropanes are kind of a little bit sinister. They creep up on you. You lose that insight. You enter a kind of a dreamlike state that's disconnected from the environment in some ways, like you're in a waking dream. So you see things. You can actually, the visions are much more stable and often seem perfectly lifelike and perfectly real. You know, you can find yourself partying with 50 people in your bedroom for an hour or two, and then suddenly you have a moment of clarity and awareness, and you realize that, you know, none of that ever happened.
Would you make the distinction of that maybe tryptamines allow you to see more of like a superposition state, or just something that's more like the true nature of reality, versus, let's say, a tropane, as you're mentioning, which could be like the inspiration for people coming up with the idea of like gods or goddesses or metaphysical realms and things of like that nature, like things that aren't actually there, as opposed to, like I said, like a tryptamine, which is definitely playing off of what we already, like our pattern recognition and everything like that.
Well, what I try and do, I try and avoid getting into or making ontological assertions about real and not real in terms of the experience. I think this is a trap that many people fall into, is to say that the normal waking world is real, and anything that diverges from that model of that version of reality is unreal. But that's a mistake for a number of reasons. Firstly, the world that you experience, as I always say, the world you experience is always this model that's being constructed by your brain. So in a sense, all experienced worlds, whatever their nature, whether they are normal waking life kind of adaptive models of the environment or not, they're all made of the same stuff. They're all made fundamentally, they're all constructed as patterns of neural activity, unified patterns of neural activity, which for reasons we don't really understand have this quality of subjectivity. There's something it's like to experience. There's something it's like to exist within these worlds. But these worlds are always built by the brain. And when you take a psychedelic, what's happening is this world model that's being constructed by your cortex is changing. The model is changing. That doesn't mean that the model is wrong or is untrue or is more true, or I always sidestep questions about whether we're seeing true reality. I don't think we really have access. We don't really have access to the true nature of the external environment, or whatever that might be, whether there really is an external environment. These are all kind of deep philosophical questions, but I think you can tie yourself in knots if you try and make a sharp distinction between the real world or the true world and hallucinatory world. Hallucinations really are non-adaptive perceptions. They are versions of your world model that perhaps are not adaptive. They don't possess immediate survival advantage, whereas the normal waking world does. It allows you to navigate and to survive and to reproduce in whatever there is out there, whatever the environment really is. We don't really know what the external world is truly like. All we do is we have this model that is somehow mapped using sensory information to the environment, and it works. It's a functional model.
Yeah,
So
I was
when you
kind
take
of
a
just I was kind of just referencing almost like the Donald Hoffman's Case Against Reality style, playing in with the psychedelic stuff. That's kind of just what I was getting at.
No. I mean, I'm a big fan of Donald Hoffman. I mean, I've been reading. I would say I knew him before he was famous, so to speak. I was reading his papers before, so it's kind of annoying now. Everyone's into Hoffman. Have you read Donald Hoffman's books? Yeah, of course I read his book. It was like decades ago when he was just writing obscure papers. When he's kind of fermenting these ideas that have become more mainstream now. It really struck me as being a really powerful way of viewing the world, in that the model is not, the brain has no yardstick by which to measure the truth of its model, and it might not even want to build true models of the environment. All it can do is build a model that is functional, that is adaptive. That's the only thing. This is the selective pressure, is to build a model that works, and the brain can never know whether it's somehow an accurate or precise model of the environment. So that's a really powerful way of thinking about psychedelics as well. It avoids you having to really get into these horrible kind of ontological questions of, is it real or is it not real? Because then you have to start asking, well, what do you mean by real? Not real. I mean, the experience is real. When you are, when you're at the peak of a DMT trip, you are experiencing that. That is as real as it is when you're in the normal waking world. It's built from the same stuff. It's an astonishingly different, remarkably different kind of experienced world, but it's built from the same stuff as your normal waking world. So in the book, really, what I try to do is focus on that model. How is that model constructed? How is that model changed? Whilst avoiding getting into questions about, are the machine elves conscious, or do they continue to exist after the trip ends? Were they there before, waiting for you? These are really cool questions, and I don't have definitive answers to them, unlike some people do. As we've learned in the last few weeks, some people have very definitive.
We'll get to the beef, that hot online beef. We'll get to the beef.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Andrew, first of all, I'm so delighted to speak with you, partly because I've loved and very much been inspired by your work, and also led a reading group. We just finished Alien Information Theory at the end of January. One of the things I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on and I have read your Substack, but would love to hear them in real time as well, is on ketamine. Now, obviously, ketamine has gotten an enormous amount of attention recently, particularly in America, where it's increasingly being used and provided and prescribed for off-label psychiatric use. This idea that it can assist with anxiety, PTSD, complex trauma, depression, etc. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on the uptick in this use, and then also if you could talk a little bit about how it differs from a classical psychedelic like psilocybin or LSD.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a big fan of ketamine. I think it's a very interesting molecule. There is
I
there
mean,
is a
me too.
yeah. Um, it it it's complicated, and that's what's kind of beautiful about ketamine is it's not a simple molecule. I mean, structurally, it's not that complicated, but I mean, in terms of its effect, it has it seems to have these kind of plateaus of effects. At low doses, it tends to be more psychedelic-like. I would call it an atypical dissociative psychedelic, something like that. I know some people don't like to call it psychedelic, and people complain, say it's not a psychedelic. Well, I think it is at low doses, certainly. The changes in neural activity that are observed after someone takes a low dose of ketamine are very similar to what you see with the classic psychedelics. So you see this disruption of world model. The world model becomes more fluid and more dynamic, less predictable. These are the kind of effects we see with the classic psychedelics as well, but through an entirely different mechanism to what you get with the classic psychedelics. So here you're looking. So classic psychedelics are these 5-HT2A agonists, partial agonists, and they're stimulating certain deep layers of the cortex, and this is how they kind of disrupt this world model. Whereas whereas ketamine works by acting at a completely different receptor type, the glutamate NMDA receptor, which it doesn't activate, it actually blocks. And this leads to some quite complex effects. These NMDA receptors are found in, well, most types of neurons, really, but they're found in populations of excitatory neurons. So these are the neurons that are kind of activating each other and stimulating activity in the cortex. But they're also found in inhibitory neurons, which are these dense networks of neurons that sit between the excitatory neurons and kind of rein in neural activity. So you have this push-pull effect, this balance that the brain has to maintain, called the EI balance, the excitation inhibition balance. And that's important to maintain a kind of a good level and to maintain control over your neural activity. And so ketamine is actually affecting both of these. It's affecting NMDA, blocking NMDA receptors on both excitatory and inhibitory neurons. Now, so what happens at low doses is it mainly affects these inhibitory interneurons. So it stops these inhibitory neurons from working properly. So it stops the inhibitory neurons inhibiting the excitatory neurons. So you get an increase in neural activity. It's like two negatives equals a positive is a good way to, it's disinhibition. So when you give someone a low dose of ketamine, you see an increase in neural activity. You see very similar kind of behavior in the brain that you see with the classic psychedelics. You get a more flexible and dynamic and less predictable world model, and you also get an increase in sensitivity to sensory information as well. So this is kind of like psychedelic. So I would call it a kind of a psychedelic. However, what's more complex about ketamine is when you start to push to the higher doses. So once you slip past the kind of psychedelic levels, you actually start to inhibit these excitatory neurons themselves by inhibiting the NMDA receptors on those neurons. So then you get this strange kind of cortical activity where you have the inhibitory neurons are being inhibited and dietary neurons being inhibited, and you get this strange kind of emergent activity of the cortex where it shifts, kind of pulses back and forth between a very inhibited, anesthetized almost state where you are basically from the environment. This would be what you would call a dissociative state or dissociative anesthetic state. But then it flips back every few seconds to a very high activity state, high complexity state, which is similar to a psychedelic state. So it's you're kind of doing this back and forth. And it's a very unusual type of neural activity, a kind of unique type of emergent neural activity, which is probably responsible for the kind of the K-hole effect when you go kind of a little bit too deep. It seems to be quite a narrow threshold between the psychedelic effects and these more dissociative anesthetized effects. So ketamine is it's in many ways it's kind of messy, in that it does have these plateaus that you don't see with the classic psychedelics. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that was a wonderful, thorough question. The second part was more a personal inquiry into your views on the uptick in its application for psychiatric purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, kind of in my work, in my research, I don't focus too much on the clinical side of things. But what's the good thing about ketamine is we know that it's fairly short acting. So you can, it's not like if you give somebody psilocybin or LSD where you have to deal with this for several hours. Has its own benefits in being able to go kind of deep. With ketamine, you have much more control over that. It seems to be, you can control the levels of the experience much better than you can with the classic psychedelics. It's also has, again, similar psychedelics, there is good evidence for neuroplasticity effects, positive neuroplasticity effects as well. So it might actually be changing the fundamental connections in the brain with use. In terms of the antidepressant effects of ketamine, that's definitely real. Rapid antidepressant effects, much quicker than you get with kind of classic antidepressant drugs such as the SSRIs, like Prozac, for example, where you have this delay of 2 to 3 weeks before you start to, or even longer before you actually start to see the benefit. With ketamine, it seems to be very fast acting. I don't think that's actually well understood.
And actually, to that point, so SSRIs, if you're taking SSRIs, people can still do ketamine therapy because there's no interaction there, correct?
That's a good point. Yeah. So with SSRIs, what seems to be happening, I remember maybe a few months ago there was a paper with a lot of attention about the serotonin hypothesis of
the depression.
And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people misunderstood, or a lot of people misunderstand the serotonin hypothesis, or understand what SSRIs are actually supposed to be doing. People thought that the idea was that they are raising your serotonin levels, right? That the reason you're depressed is because your serotonin levels are too low. That is probably not correct. And if that were the cause of your depression, then you should reasonably your depression to be ameliorated and levels of depression reduced just a few hours after taking the drug, right? As the levels of serotonin actually rise very quickly. But the antidepressant effect takes longer to materialize. And that's because it requires a change in the expression of certain receptors. So over time, by increasing levels of serotonin, your brain kind of adjusts and changes the expression of various receptors. And that is probably what's responsible for the antidepressant effects of SSRIs. It's not that it's just increasing serotonin.
Yeah. I mean, I've taken them before for my OCD. They definitely had a positive effect. It's not like they don't work, like there's this idea, like you mentioned, this myth that's like, oh, just abandon that for this, or they were wrong the whole time. Like, I don't necessarily think that's the case, but it's like for like OCD specifically, I don't think it's a chemical imbalance thing. It's more of like
No.
thought loops that get embedded over time that they're just bad thinking habits, if you will, or I don't know how to explain it. I've written this out before when I had these moments or like epiphanies in altered states of what's actually going on in my own head. But yeah, it seems to be these thought patterns or thought loops that become kind of on a turnaround, and they just keep playing over and over and over. And it's up to you, the person who has the OCD or the compulsive thinking or whatever, to break out of that. It's not about, from my understanding, and like I said, doing my own research and looking into my own mind, I don't believe it's a chemical thing. And I'm not saying that the depression thing isn't, but yeah, I think that was the myth for a long time. It's like when I remember when I first found out I had it in my mid-20s, so we're talking 15 years ago, oh, take this will make you feel better. And then I ended up taking 8 different SSRIs and none of them worked, and we're still trying to figure out like what's going on. Well, it wasn't about the medicine, it's about the CBT, the therapy, the ability to get outside of yourself. So yeah, I mean, I would agree with you too on what you're saying about the SSRIs, because they do have a positive effect, but I mean, to what level, I don't know.
Yeah, I think the brain is very plastic in that it can change. You can certain patterns of neural activity can become almost like habitual in that they are strength. The more that certain pathways are used, the stronger they become. So this applies to learning to play the piano, right? Eventually, over time, those neural pathways that control these complex muscular motor patterns become more embedded, and you can play the piano very quickly, almost unconsciously. And unfortunately, that can also apply to ways of thinking about your self-perception. And if you get yourself into this negative thinking, these loops of negative thoughts about yourself and of your life, and that can become kind of ingrained, if you like.
Yeah, I think a ball of yarn is actually a good analogy. That's what I've written down before. Like a ball, like it just keeps getting, if it gets down towards the middle of that ball of yarn, it's going to be a tough time getting that thing untangled,
Exactly. And so this is what we think anyway. Well, the kind of the prevailing hypothesis about what psychedelics are doing is they're loosening up. They are kind of it's kind of like if you've got a piece of glass, right, and it's very rigid, and it's in a particular shape. But if you heat that glass up, it becomes kind of more kind of plastic and fluid, and then you can kind of readjust it into a new shape, and then as it cools, it will set into that new shape. So the idea is you're bringing the brain, the cortex, into this kind of hot state where it's much more fluid and much more dynamic. These ingrained patterns of connectivity become loosened, and you can start to establish new patterns of more positive patterns of connectivity. So this is why the psychotherapeutic side of it, the psychotherapeutic support that comes with the psychedelic therapy is important. It allows you to establish more positive, to break out of the old ways of thinking, loosened up by psychedelics, and then establish more positive patterns. And then as the psychedelic wears off, hopefully those more positive patterns will become ingrained. So that's kind of the prevailing wisdom there of how the classic psychedelics work. Now with ketamine, I think it's you can imagine something similar, but there seems to be much more rapid clinical effect, just with intranasal ketamine without undergoing a full-blown psychedelic or dissociative anesthetized experience. You can get these very rapid antidepressant effects of ketamine. So there's still a lot we don't understand. I'm far from an expert on the etiology of depression, but it's certainly true that there's a lot we don't understand about the mechanisms of depression. It's almost certainly, it's multifactorial. There's a lot of things going on in the brain that causes depression, and there's certainly a number of ways that you can manipulate that system and kind of break it out of those negative patterns and kind of rearrange your brain, so to speak, rearrange those patterns of thought. And so I think, ketamine is just another tool alongside the classic psychedelic, a very safe, fast acting tool that doesn't need to be taken every day for the rest of your life, and actually seems to somehow get at the root cause. I think the problem with a lot of psychiatric medication is that they are treating the symptoms. They're making you feel better. They might be elevating your mood temporarily, but whether or not they're actually dealing with the fundamental issue deep down in that complex pattern of neuroconnectivity is a different question entirely. And I think psychedelics are probably the closest we've got in this or last century, really, to a tool that can actually start to deal with the fundamental cause and the fundamental source of depression.
Yeah, no, good point.
I was going to say my daughter actually works at a clinic that does ketamine therapy as well too. My wife would have murdered me if I didn't say that. And actually, I had a question too.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I don't know a lot about this stuff. I'm new to it. And it's important to me because I'm a combat veteran, PTSD. So my question's actually, what importance do you think ketamine therapy is for people with like trauma-related mental health issues? Is it disassociation an important part of that?
That's a good question. I can't give you a definitive answer there, but you can imagine with post-traumatic stress, you've got it's a different type of ingrained neural activity, right? With depression, it's about negative thinking about yourself, whatever, right? Whereas with PTSD, you can imagine that as being a different. It's directed somewhere else. It's directed to the trauma, reliving the trauma and experiencing the negative emotional response to that trauma. But again, you can think about this is an ingrained pattern. The brain learns things very, very well and remembers things and attaches emotional affect to experiences. So, that's obviously very important in our evolution, is that we associate the bad things that happen to us, or good things, but particularly bad things that happen to us. The brain will attach emotions to them, which is obviously important in the future. Then if you encounter that same kind of situation again, you can remember how bad it was and how you need to avoid it. And that's obviously very, very useful if you want to avoid predators, for example, or if you want to avoid the same kind of situations that got you in trouble the last time. It's good to attach a negative emotion to that.
Do you think the PTSD though, because he was in the war, do you think that living every day through like shellings and that anxiety and fear every single day, you're like creating that negative pathway or whatever we're talking about, and then when veterans come home, they're so used to being on that alert awareness level, maybe their amygdala's gone crazy or maybe something else, but something like that.
Yeah, precisely. And the brain will also, there will also be kind of adaptive responses to that the brain will attempt to reset, if you like, or readjust its level, so to speak. So I think there's a lot of very complicated neural behavior going on deep in the brain, and so trying to get at that and deal with it and kind of reset the brain and bring it back to a more stable and well-adjusted state, I think is very difficult, particularly because these patterns can become so ingrained. So what's great about psychedelics is you can kind of loosen the whole system up, make it much more plastic and fluid, so you can actually start to work with it more, just like heating up a piece of of glass, you can then start to, as I said, adjust it. So I think it's not easy. It's not like if you have a psychedelic experience, you're suddenly going to be cured from PTSD or from depression or anxiety or whatever. But it brings you into a kind of primed state. It primes your brain for these kind of adjustments, these kind of resetting mechanisms. These are more valuable in that way. So you definitely need the experienced clinicians there as well, I think, to really get the most of psychedelics.
Awesome. We got a couple questions from people. One from our buddy Kevin Churko, who's also a fan of yours. He said he wouldn't be able to check in live, but he wanted to know regarding the audio that, obviously you have a visual component of the DMT experience, but what about the audio component? And he's wondering what the hell's making those, if this is all part of the visual cortex, what's making all those sounds and synth sounds and delays and he wanted to know how can he download those.
Yeah. I mean, this is so obviously with things like DMT, it is the visual aspect that people are most interested in, right? But it definitely, there is, particularly at the beginning of the trip, before you become overwhelmed with the visual, there's often a particular kind of I can't describe it, like
the high pitch ringing.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So obviously, whilst the visual cortex is primarily affected here, you have your visual cortex kind of sitting at the back of your brain. The auditory cortices are kind of at the side, and then at the top you have where a lot of these sensations are kind of brought together and unified. So it's certainly not the case that DMT is only affecting the visual cortices. There's no reason why it wouldn't also affect the auditory cortices to some degree. And in fact, a lot of what we don't understand is why is the DMT such a visual experience, for example, whereas diisopropyl tryptamine, I think it is, I forget, or is it dipropyl tryptamine, but one of them, but very closely related molecule, is primarily auditory. So here you get kind of a drop in the it's like your auditory system is dropped down an octave. Everything becomes much lower and slower. So it's an auditory hallucinogen, if you like. Some hallucinogens, I think it's maybe monomethyltryptamine. So this is like DMT, but with one of those methyl groups on the nitrogen removed. This is kind of a spatial hallucinogen. So it's visual, but not in the normal, not in that you actually see visions, but your perception of space is altered. And we don't really understand why that is the case. People have thought about it, looked at the kind of the neural activation signatures and how it affects gene expression in different parts of the brain and that kind of thing. But I don't think there's a clear answer actually yet as to why the visual aspects are much more prominent than the auditory aspects, and why certain molecules might actually flip that and give a more auditory experience. But your experience of a world is multisensory. You obviously experience, we are primarily visual creatures, so our vision is by far our most important sense. But of course, the experience, the subjective world, also has an auditory component, and this can be affected by psychedelics as well. But I guess with DMT, you're so overwhelmed with the visual aspect. I don't think many people focus that much on the auditory aspect. When you read trip reports, at the beginning of the experience, people often describe this tone, but then once you kind of break through and you're into this bizarre hyperdimensional world, the people don't tend to report so much on the auditory aspects. I think what you need is a really good study that focused on the auditory aspect and says, forget about what you saw, if you can, and try to focus on what you hear, because I think that would be it's a largely unexplored avenue of research, is what's going on with the auditory and how the kind of languages that these machine elves might be speaking and that kind of thing. I think it's a cool thing to think about, but I just don't think we have much understanding of the auditory aspects of the psychedelic experience, to be honest.
Interesting. We've got another question from Figu. Does your causa sui grid theory necessitate a first cause God or an unmoved mover?
I'm not sure I can even pass that. A first cause God. Well, I mean, he's talking about, what did he call it? What kind of grid did he call it?
Causa sui, SUI, grid theory.
Okay, is this Latin, is it? Sounds like a philosopher.
Yeah.
Throwing in these Latin terms here. Well, I mean, in alien information theory, I posit, and again, this is not my worldview, I don't believe this to be necessarily the case, but I posit the idea of some advanced hyper-intelligence that constructed this code from which our lower dimensional slice emerged. So I think it could go both ways. I don't think it requires necessarily. I mean, you're kind of faced with the same problem in explaining the DMT worlds, or with my model of the DMT worlds, as you are, as any person is trying to make sense of our existence. It's easy to kind of hand the problem to an omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent being that created it all.
It's like panspermia. You could say panspermia is where we came from, but it doesn't ultimately answer the question, where does life come
Right,
from?
you're just pushing it back. Yeah. With panspermia, you're pushing it back to another. So, well, okay, we can't solve the problem of abiogenesis, the construction of biology or the emergence of biology from a non-biological system on Earth. So we'll just say that it came from somewhere else. But then you're faced with the same problem, but you've pushed it away successfully to a different planet, which might, that might help you in some ways. It might help you might buy you some time if you don't think that life could have emerged on this Earth within the time constraints, when life would have been, the Earth would have been habitable to living organisms. That might help there, but it doesn't get you to the root of the issue of where living organisms emerged from in the first place. And I think it's the same kind of thing that we're doing here, that we could say, okay, that there was some God, we can call it God, or we can call it some alien super intelligence that existed long before our universe emerged. But I don't think we're any happier having said that. I think we're still faced with, well, where did that God come from, and what is our relationship to that? So I think these are really fascinating things to think about. I don't rule out the idea that we might, that our universe might. I mean, it's cool to think. It's also kind of terrifying, right? The idea that our universe emerged or was programmed by some astonishingly intelligent superpowers, very, very old, extremely advanced being.
Yeah, Chat GPT, that's who created.
Well, there you go, right? I mean, we're getting hints at the kind of intelligence, right?
We're all just mid-journey art.
Well, that's kind of it. Terence McKenna did say, we are embedded in some kind of work of art. That's what I quote in alien information theory. And I think you get that sense when you use DMT. You are confronted with what appears to be an undeniable intelligence of unreckonable power. That it's easy to say, okay, this must be God. I don't think necessarily it must be God, but there is a real sense that you're dealing with something that is so intelligent, that is so advanced, that is so way beyond anything that we could conceive of existing, that anything you could have imagined of existing before you smoke the drug, before you take the medicine, so to speak. That in itself is why DMT is so horrifying and appalling, is that you're confronted with something that is that just shakes your fundamental ontological foundations, right? That we exist, that we are the highest intelligence, at least within our corner of the Milky Way, and that we do sit at the pinnacle of what intelligence looks like. And then to be confronted with an intelligence that is orders of magnitude way beyond anything that our little human brain could ever dream of is horrifying. What to do with that intelligence? You could cast it as a god figure, if you like, and say, okay, this is the all-loving creator, our Lord and Savior, or whatever. That might make you feel better, but I don't think there's any real reason to believe that. I think it's just as likely that we're dealing with an intelligence that emerged somewhere, emerged in some other orthogonal dimension, in some orthogonal reality, in some other place that has, for reasons we don't really understand, has this deep connection to our reality. That we are this very, very thin slice of this much larger, much richer, and much more complex structure within which these much older and more advanced intelligences have emerged. I don't think there's anything wooey or mystical or even that far out or wild about that idea. That there are other places within which much high levels of intelligence could have emerged.
I mean, even if it was, who gives a shit? Because we don't even know why we're here, right? This is weird. We're having this conversation through technology. Who are you? What am I? Like the fact that people don't even think about that on a day-to-day basis is the most bizarre thing of all to me, is that people go through life as a cog in the machine and don't even think twice. And yet, there's a small portion of society like us, whether we're nerds or scientists or whatever, we're all thinking about this stuff constantly. So, to the people that think that we're weird or, woo woo or whatever, who cares? Back off.
Well, I agree. I mean, yeah, who cares at all? And I certainly don't. And yes, we are. We exist within our little prosaic bubble and assume that this is what reality is, right? This is just our little. But everyone knows that we're just this small green blue dot in a very, very small corner of a vast universe. That in itself makes us not insignificant necessarily, but makes us very, 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 very small part of the full picture. Then if you add on the possibility of other places, other universes, other dimensions of reality that we just have no conception of. I describe in one of my lectures recently, it's like if you were a character within a 1990s computer game or something, right? And that reality would be the way that reality is, in laws of physics that would rule in that would be the way that you assumed reality was. You would have no conception of the fact that you were being programmed with you were being programmed by some inconceivable intelligence outside of the game that was controlling the physics. Yet to us, that seems perfectly obvious, right? Yeah, you write some code and you can build these simulated worlds. And to us, it's kind of a relatively simple thing. Any particularly savvy 15-year-old now could probably, who's good with computers, could probably code some kind of simple game and control the physics, some kind of basic physics engine. To us, it's not difficult. So if you try and imagine us as being within that system, we are part of a quite what appears to us to be a kind of a complex game, if you like, and we have no idea. We have no way of conceiving what might be out there and what might actually be influencing us, in the same way that we might, you can change a line of code and you can alter the fundamental physics of this little universe that you're running on your laptop. The character in the game would have no way of conceiving how that could possibly work. It would be beyond their imagination. It would be stranger than they can suppose, right? So I think that's the way to think about it, is imagine us being within that. I'm not saying that this is a simulation, by the way. I'm not saying that, but it's that kind of relationship, if you like, in that we simply have no idea as what is going on outside of our little prosaic reality, and we can't make any judgments about the relationship between our reality and that reality, whether it is a programmed kind of relationship or something very different. We simply don't know, which is why I always say when you're confronted with an ostensible alien hyperintelligence in the DMT space, you need to be very careful because they could well be exactly who they say they are. They might not be. They might really just be wild fabrications of the cortex. But I think we have to be very careful about dismissing these things as mere hallucination when they have qualities that would argue against that. I think we could really be dealing with something that is truly beyond our ability to conceive, and I think that in itself is almost miraculous, that we might be able to actually interface with such a profound and advanced and old and astonishingly sophisticated intelligence like that. So I think we have to be careful about just believing those that would say, oh, actually, neuroscience tells you it's just hallucination. Your brain is amazing. It can do amazing things. This kind of promissory science of, we can't really explain everything yet, but don't worry, we will.
And it's like, it's boring too. Like to anticipate that science is just going to answer everything at some point it's the most bogus way out. And I hate that. And you'll see a lot of that in a lot of the humanities, because obviously with empirical science, you have a better understanding of the metaphysics of those fields, but within the humanities, it's a lot more speculative and there's a lot less evidence. So I know Leah maybe wanted to ask a question. Go ahead, Leah.
Yeah, so my next question kind of rides the coattails of what you were just talking about around belief. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how your beliefs on DMT particularly may have changed over time.
I don't have they changed. I think they've matured. They've matured in that.
Good.
I'm still as confounded by DMT as I was when I first smoked it 20 years ago, maybe. I still don't feel that we've gotten to the bottom of it. I think we're still scratching the surface, I think, of what DMT means, and I think there's no way yet, whilst we understand a lot more about what's actually going on in the brain. That's what I've kind of focused on over the last decade or so, is what's actually going on in the brain. How is our world model changed when you smoke DMT? I think that's one avenue of thinking. But in terms of the ontology, whether these beings really are, we really are dealing with intelligent, conscious beings that exist from their own side, that are just as unable to deny their existence as we are unable to deny ours. I don't think we're in a position to make any kind of judgment. I try and keep this middle ground, this agnostic. As I said, an elf agnostic. I think as soon as you put yourself to one
Whoa. That's what got you in trouble, bro. That's what got you in trouble.
Elf agnostic.
yeah, I'm an elf
What
agnostic.
would Terence say?
What would Terence say? Well, I think Terence. Well, despite what he might have said, I think he was also an elf agnostic, actually, from what he was talking about.
Mhm.
He was never
Sure.
made particular assertions about what he speculated about what we could be dealing with. But I think as soon as you place yourself into one camp or another, you say, okay, this is just hallucination. It's just your brain making it up, blah, 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 blah. Or if you go to the other camp, say these are definitely demons, or these are definitely plant spirits, or these are definitely jinns, or I don't know, right? What or some other creature of the netherworlds. Once you do that, once you place yourself in either camp, then, well, where do you go from there? You've already made up your mind, right? You already know the truth. So what's the point in having a discussion? I always try to tread that middle ground of agnosticism, where I don't claim that we are dealing with actual autonomous conscious intelligences, and I certainly don't claim the opposite, that we're not. And to me, that seems to be the most responsible and rational position to take, bearing in mind what we actually understand and what we don't understand. And ultimately, I expect it will be the most productive as well. In the end, it might turn out that we can explain absolutely everything about DMT without having to invoke autonomous intelligences, but it might turn out that we can't, and that we might have to confront the unthinkable. Well, what for many people would be the unthinkable, which is that not only are we not the only intelligence within this universe, but actually that we might be on a very, very low level compared to intelligences outside of our thin slice of reality with whom we can communicate, right? I mean, can you imagine anything more profound than that? That would be the greatest discovery in the history of humankind, right? I mean, fuck the wheel. I mean, we're talking about the discovery of I love wheels, by the way, for wheel lovers. But just the idea that they're not only are there intelligences outside of our universe, not just in our universe. I mean, that I think most of us accept is almost a certainty. But not only are there intelligences outside of our universe, or somehow alongside or our universe in some way, orthogonal to our universe, not only do they exist, but that we actually have a very simple means of actually communicating with them that doesn't require firing pulses of electromagnetic radiation across the heavens and waiting for 750,000 years for a reply. But some,
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, this is actually what you're saying is actually very relevant right now. In the U.S., we have all these balloons, or God knows what the other three things were. People are looking to the skies. They're looking for the government to tell them yes, no, maybe so. When we have this thing that we all produce in our bodies, but you can also enjoy the exogenous version of it, which will put you in communication with something otherworldly. Now, whether that comes from within or it's external, nobody knows. But I think it's important to point out that we're all looking to the skies when maybe we should be looking within, or looking.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact is that if there is intelligence elsewhere in the universe, which there almost certainly is, the vast proportion of that is likely to be post-biological. The proportion of life that exists in this very brief technological wet-bodied, wet-brained phase is likely to be very, very small, because once an intelligence reaches the stage where they can conceive of becoming some kind of artificial intelligence is where we are now, right? I mean, everyone's talking about artificial intelligence recently, and everyone's familiar with the idea that we might one day be able to kind of dispense with our physical form and instantiate ourselves in some way in a some kind of artificial intelligence form or some kind of digital form. Once you reach that stage where you can conceive of it, you're probably only a few hundred years from actually achieving it. These things tend to happen, they accelerate, right? So we might be much closer than we imagine. So the chances of catching discovering an intelligence that is kind of still in that narrow technological phase. Obviously, before then, there's no way to communicate with them because they're going to be trapped on their little planet just like we are. They're not going to be, if they're in a pre-technological phase, they're not going to be communicating across the heavens, right? So, but then you reach this technological phase where we are now, which might only last a few hundred years, where we can start thinking about communicating with the heavens. So that's kind of what the SETI program is looking for. It's looking for those beings that happen to be within that very brief temporal window when they can be communicated with. Once they transcend the biological form and become post-biological, then they're going to be effectively completely transparent to the normal modes of communication. You're not going to be communicating them with electromagnetic radiation. That is extremely unlikely.
We need to disband SETI and invest all that money into DMTx. That's my proposal.
Right, exactly. So the point is when you
let's
Are we going to talk about DMTx?
Hold on. Let him finish his thought. I know he had some.
Sorry.
So my thought is simply that the vast amount of intelligence and beyond is likely to be post-biological. And so we need to think about, well, what's the best way to communicate with the post-biological intelligence? And it's my position that psychedelics might be the way of achieving that, somehow gating the flow of information from these normally transparent and hidden and apparently non-existent beings, that psychedelics might be the mode with which we communicate with them, and much quicker, much more efficient than trying to communicate across the cosmos. That was my final thought.
Yeah, quantum entanglement or psi, whatever you want to call it. I'm all on board with that, especially since they were going to call ayahuasca telepathy initially, and I know our buddies the Dreaming Jaguars participated in that experiment that David Luke was doing to see if they could connect via that. So I find all that very interesting. I don't know. I never saw the results. We had them on right after. I forgot. I think we were waiting for the paper to come out, so I'd have to go back and check with them. But yeah, I do want to talk about DMTx. So we had Daniel McQueen on about a year ago for his release of his book Psychedelic Cannabis, which highly recommend if you like cannabis and edibles and things like that. It's a great guide for that. But yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit about DMTx? Where is it going? What's going on with it? That whole thing.
Yes, I was on a call with Daniel McQueen just last week, actually, and with Chris Timmerman, who's heading up the DMTx program at Imperial College in London. They've just completed the first trial in humans of DMTx for 30 minutes. I think the paper will be published. I think it's been submitted and accepted, maybe. So it should be out sometime this year, hopefully. And that will give, obviously, the full results. What's clear from, what was originally my aim, going kind of back to the original idea back in 2015, and the paper I wrote with Rick Strassman, the idea was that you can take this brief roller coaster trip of DMT and stabilize it, induce somebody into the DMT state, maintain a stable brain concentration over time, and basically hold them within the space. with the ultimate aim being that the state would stabilize to some extent over time as your brain adapts to constructing this altered world model, and that would then allow you to perform much more extensive exploration and navigation and experimentation within the space. And you can imagine a whole new field of research would be opened up by that. Just like when we learned how to deep sea dive or send those subs down to the bottom of the ocean, that allows you then to opens up a whole new field of research, of so many new things to explore and test and that kind of thing. So that was the idea originally, and from what we know, I haven't seen all of the results yet. That seems to have been borne out in that what the Imperial team were able to do is to bring somebody into the space and actually maintain a consistent intensity of experience at several dose levels. So they can bring someone into a more kind of shallow sub-breakthrough state and hold them there, or they can push them all the way through into the full breakthrough visionary state, and maintain that for about 30 minutes. And there's no evidence that it would, it couldn't be extended for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. So we now have this amazing technology, I think, that really opens up the DMT space. Now we can start to think about those questions about, can we establish two-way communication with these machine elves? Can we ask them questions? Can we get information from them? Can we perform experiments in the space? All this kind of stuff. It's kind of exciting.
Do you still experiment yourself? I mean, obviously, you can say what you want or don't want to, but do you still experiment? And when you experiment, do you try to investigate these worlds still, or?
Well, I mean, personally, I've had many experiences. I'll talk about the past rather than the present, but I'm not a great psychonaut in that I haven't discovered some amazing technique to navigate the space or to explore the space, or any more than anyone else who uses DMT reasonably frequently or infrequently. I think there's a lot of what would you call it? Kind of underground science that goes on around, which I think is quite valuable. Beyond, aside from the kind of the academic stuff, which I was involved in, the DMTx stuff, I think that people are discovering now, developing their own techniques for exploring the space. Using these vape pens, these dab rigs, I think they call them, or these e-liquids now, which they dissolve the DMT in, and can actually
I
maintain.
know. I've never done it, but I know that the DMT pens actually preserve it longer. From what I understand, Dick Kahn, who was a pretty intense psychonaut, gave us the DL on that. He said that, I don't know how much longer, but he said a lot longer. So I guess it preserves your stuff. So.
Yeah. I think this is very effective. I'm all for alternate modes of administration. I think we need to treat DMT as the technology that I think it is really, and bring our best technological tools to the table here. I don't think we should get too attached any particular mode of administration. I know some people have kind of bad feelings about injection or bringing in electronic equipment to try and to administer DMT. I don't see that as a problem at all. I think we should. I see that as being much more respectful to the DMT experience itself, in that we are trying our best to not just kind of burst into their realm for a few seconds and then for a couple of minutes, look around wide-eyed and say, "What the fuck, man? This is cool," and then bugger off again. But actually, to develop it as a technology and learn to use it, I think that's all part of the process of developing DMT as a technology. And I think we should embrace any new techniques that people discover for for navigating and maintaining our presence within the space for much longer periods of time, whether it's using this infusion technology, which is not going to be accessible for 99% of the population, but certainly these vape pens are. And they're much safer as well, and you have much better control. You're not burning it. You don't have naked flames to worry about. You can do it. You have this small device that is very safe. It's not going to blow up if it's a good quality one, and you can redose at intervals. And kind of keep yourself within that level. So I think, yeah, I'm all for DMT vape pens, but you should make them yourself. I mean, you should. I don't think people should be buying them off the internet. I think it's so
like
easy
anything
now
else, test your shit. If you are getting it from, if you're getting it from anything that's, like obviously cannabis, mushrooms, if you're a well-versed psychonaut, those are pretty easy to investigate. But when it comes to powders and things like that, especially given the state of fentanyl and people chopping up fentanyl and all sorts of things, just test your shit. I've had friends die. I've had friends of friends die. Lots of people I know in my community growing up. So yeah, just test your shit. But listen, Leah's got to bounce out here. We're going to continue on for a little bit, but I just wanted to let Leah go gracefully as she requested.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Leah, for joining us. I know she would have some good questions for Andrew, and I enjoyed being in Leah's book club where we read Alien Information Theory. So check out Leah online at Leah Prime on Twitter. She has a Substack, and she also does a podcast on YouTube called The Invisible Night School weekly. So check that out as well.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Andrew, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank
and of
you.
course, Shane. Thank you.
Leah.
Thank you,
Peace.
John.
It's always good to see you. I'm having some back spasms, so that's why I'm kind of wiggling around.
You're fine.
That's why I couldn't sit down. So I'm going to bounce as well. It's great to meet you, and thank you for answering that question.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, Shane. Go get your back taken care of. All right. Nerd time. No, I'm just joking. But I do want to get to some of the other stuff that I mentioned earlier. So in terms of the whole machine elf thing. So I don't know if people follow, if everybody that follows us on Twitter, I'm sure they know I mentioned something kind of cryptically about it on my own feed, but somebody put out a video talking about machine elves and how they're just in your head and it's just a byproduct or hallucinations, or your brain causing these hallucinations and you interacting with them, blah, 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 blah. We don't have to name this person or whatever, but so then you responded in kind of just like a funny, goofy way, which you do to a lot of things. You do it to my posts. I've seen you do it to a lot of people's posts. I didn't see any harm in what you posted. And all of a sudden this dude goes on like a warpath and starts like attacking you, your books, your work, calling your stuff pseudoscience, and you're convincing people that there's these living, breathing elves in these realms and blah, blah, blah. And like, obviously this dude hasn't read your books.
No, certainly not.
Didn't really have a philosophical bone in his body from what I saw. So, yeah, I mean, I thought you handled it really well. I mean, you weren't mean or anything, even though he kept attacking you. What do you think's going on there? Is there a certain set of academia that's very dogmatic that these are manifestations in the mind, and maybe some of these people are getting irritated because of some of the more speculative or metaphysical talks or metaphysics or whatever? I mean, like, what's going on there?
Yeah, I think there's certainly an element of that. I think people like to be, certain types of people anyway, they like to be right about things. They like to feel that they have got kind of a handle on the truth. And they don't like anyone questioning that. And certainly when it comes to the machine elves, I mean, basically, there's a bit of background. He made a video that claimed that the machine elves are kind of a common argument, which is that they are a McKenna effect, that people started seeing elves and elf-like beings in the DMT state because they'd heard Terence McKenna talking about elves, and that in fact all it is just your brain. Your brain, that old tired argument that your brain is amazing. You've no idea about the potential of things that your brain can create. We don't know half of it. That's where the machine elves are, in that little black box that we don't understand yet, but don't worry, we will at some point in the future. That's not particularly satisfactory to me, and I pointed that out, that it's not acceptable or not convincing for me when someone says, "Oh, it's just your brain is more complicated than we can suppose." It's throwing all of the things we don't know into this big box of promissory science that will eventually we'll kind of get to explaining. So that I've never been convinced by that approach to what we can't explain, and also his assertion that it's a McKenna effect. I mean, that's something I've dealt with several times in the past. I wrote a long essay that involved a discussion of this back in 2016 or something. So I'm not new to this argument.
Well, what I found the most interesting thing was he felt like you were attacking his research, he said, but in reality he was just taking a common trope, which is that came from McKenna, calling it his research, and then being offended that you opposed it, which was just a bizarre, the whole thing just started off as like a miscommunication on bizarre foot. And then you have a couple other psychedelic academics chime in like, "Hey, I love both of you. Can we just figure this out? Blah, 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 blah." Like, that's all nice and wonderful, but how about somebody having your fucking back? Grow a fucking backbone. Like, Jesus, like, I put out a cryptic tweet because I didn't want to bring more attention to it, but I'm just waiting for somebody bigger to be like, "Hey, calm down. This is not how you do this. You either have a debate or you have..." Look, I've seen you disagree with people. I saw you had a disagreement on Psychedelics Today with Peter Sherstedt about your first book, and I don't think that was like malicious. You guys disagree. I'm sure you still disagree, but that doesn't change the fact that you could still have a civil discussion or debate about it, right? I mean, I don't know why.
Absolutely. I mean, me and Peter. I mean, he's a friend of mine, and he comes from the philosophy side of things, so he has that particular angle, and I have a very different angle. So it's where they meet and clash sometimes, which is kind of cool. So we can have long discussions about this, and I think we both learn from each other. So yeah, of course, discussions and debate and disagreement is all part of. No one, certainly with something like DMT, we're not all going to agree on different aspects of it, but when somebody points out that, well, elves have been, and elf-like beings have been reported in the DMT report literature going back to the 1950s and through to the 1960s and beyond, way before, when Terence McKenna was still a little kid, long before he was talking about machine elves. Sure, he gave them that cute name that everyone.
Well, I mean, but there's mythology to support. There's the fae, fairy people, little people. I mean, this is a common archetype.
Exactly.
And to imagine that those people weren't partaking is crazy, because we know a lot of those people were partaking in psychedelic rituals. So
right. So these Lilliputian type little beings, so they give them different names. They might take different forms, but they seem to be unified in their character. These lively, giggling, mischievous, trickstery kind of beings we're talking about. Whether you call them machine elves, of course, nobody called them machine elves before McKenna because he gave them that name, but that's just his cute little name. He called them tykes. He called them. He had lots of different little names for them.
And I could see that, though, too. I could see the machine aspect, like coloring the experience or putting it in your subconscious. So when you're in that space, you're thinking like, oh, I thought these were just colors and patterns, but now I'm starting to see this whole machine thing. Like, I could see something like that. But yeah, again, I just the whole way it just went down. Like I said, I think there's a better way, especially coming from the psychedelic community. And people have used psychedelics, you would imagine that they'd have a better way to handle these things. I don't know. That's why I made the comment, like, just because you use psychedelics doesn't make you a better person, because it doesn't. There's so many assholes in the psychedelic community, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's trying to, I don't know, I get the feeling he's trying to establish himself as being the voice of the young hip psychedelic crowd. And I put a little spanner in the works there, and questioned him on this subject, and he didn't like it. I think he took offense also to the way that I responded to one of his arguments. He didn't like the way I used a mixture of lowercase and uppercase letters.
Yeah, I mean, but here's the thing. I had my take on it was just from looking at what was going on. His video, he's trying to establish himself on YouTube. He's obviously doing the thing where you come for the top dog or somebody and you make noise and you're trying to get more YouTube followers, and it's like I felt like it was a little bit more of that, like take a shot at one of the old heads, kind of a thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think I'm one of the old heads yet.
No, I don't consider you that, but I'm just saying, like, I don't know, that dude seemed kind of young, so I don't know.
No, he's certainly younger than me. I mean, he's a PhD student, so yeah, he's younger than me for sure.
So yeah, I don't know. I don't have any ill will. I just thought that whole thing was just bizarre to me, like the whole interaction. It was just like a misunderstanding, and he should have stopped when people were telling him that, and whatever. But let's get to the meat of this thing. Do you think these things are internal, or do you think they're external? Now, before you answer that, I have never had DMT entity experiences. I have had entity experiences. One was hippie flipping. I took a large dose of psilocybin and MDMA. I had an entity experience on that. Another time, just MDMA, I had these sentient jellyfish flowing around, like conveying messages and shit. Very bizarre. I didn't actually know MDMA could do that. I took 300 milligrams, which is kind of a large dose, I think.
Wow.
But
yeah.
But yeah, so, and I had to leave a fish concert. So I've had a few other ones. I'm not going to mention them. But anyways, my point being that obviously this is not just subject to DMT. What do you think's happening there? Do you think that the DMT entity thing is a very specific version of the entity, or do you think they're all just kind of the same thing? It's just easier to tap into that via DMT.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with Salvinorin as well, entity experiences are also very common, and with high dose psilocybin. I think what DMT does is it's very efficient at breaking through into that state where entity experiences are common, but other drugs can get there. But with mushrooms, you need quite high doses to kind of reach that same kind of level. So I don't think it's 100% DMT specific. I just think DMT is very good at getting you into that space. Now, in terms of the do I think they're all in your head, or do I think they exist somehow out of your head at the same time? I think the answer is a mixture of the two, possibly, because even if we are dealing with an intelligence that is from elsewhere, that we're somehow communicating with or gaining access to, your brain still has to kind of build a model of that being. There's no reason to think that just because an entity appears as an elf or appears as a mantis or something, an insectoid creature, that is their kind of true form or their true nature. This is just the brain using these deeply embedded archetypal structures. We all carry around this inherited neural architecture that has this propensity, this inherent propensity to build certain kinds of structures, be it reptiles, snakes, spiders, insects, and also for some reason these kind of small, lively, mischievous beings, trickstery beings as well. The brain, we all inherit that kind of archetypal toolbox from which we can construct images, and so I think, but that doesn't mean that they're purely that. I think they're purely that we all have the idea that we all have this collective unconscious within which these beings are kind of swimming around and existing. That's not really what going back to Jung, what he was really saying there. It's just that we all inherit the same kind of brain. We all have markings of our evolutionary past. We all carry those what are often termed neurognostic structures, these basic patterns of inherited connectivity that allow us to build the kind of the basic building blocks from which we construct our model of the world, and these are ingrained, they're inherited, we all have them. And I think what's happening with DMT is that your brain is drawing upon these tools. It's faced with the highly unusual patterns of information from wherever, right? It could be from some other reality, it could be from somehow emerging within your cortex for other reasons, but your brain is faced with dealing with these extremely extraordinary patterns of information, and it is trying to find the best model that fits that pattern of information, and sometimes that an elf-like being is the best way to do that. If the information has those kind of qualities, then you might represent these beings as being elf-like, but they might differ in their form, because archetypes are the basic propensity, the basic potentiality to build certain types of images and symbols, but they're also colored by your experience and your culture and what you learn. So if I asked you to draw an elf, you would draw a different picture than somebody in Ireland or something. They might draw a little green guy with a pointy hat. You might draw someone that looked more like Gollum or something. I don't know, right? The archetypes, as they kind of manifest, as they're drawn upon, they become colored and filled in by experience, by culture, on a very kind of individual basis. So just because the elves have very different forms, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are kind of different or that they're purely individual. It just simply means that your brain is kind of is building its own version, if you like, of the elf, based upon that lowest level archetypal structure, but also how it's been colored and informed and filled in by at the individual level. So this is really the problem, I think, is that you can't get away from, even if we are dealing with an intelligence from elsewhere, we can't get away from the fact that it's always going to have a personal aspect. It's always going to be your brain is always going to have to draw upon what it can, what it knows, the kind of patterns and models that it has to kind of to create an image, to create a model of these beings, and that's why I always say it's a combination. These entities, even if they are purely external, even if they exist before you go into the DMT state, and for some reason you are communicating with some kind of advanced intelligence, what you actually see, what you actually experience, the form that the entities take are always going to have a personal, subjective component that you can't get away from. So that's why it's so difficult to draw a line between and clearly kind of differentiate between a pure hallucination, a pure fabrication of the cortex, and something else, something more unthinkable, something far stranger.
Yeah, the first part of that would be, so like the tough part of answering that is, what is consciousness? Because you're answering it as if though consciousness is a byproduct of our biology, and a resulting of the function of our brain, right? And I'm not saying that you believe this, by the way. I'm just saying how you just described it. In reality, we know that we don't know what consciousness is. It's called the hard problem of consciousness for a reason. But let's just say hypothetically the brain is like some sort of receiver, and consciousness is non-local. Like maybe we're just a instrument which kind of plays into kind of what we're talking about, because when you get into these realms, let's say, again, it's non-local, our consciousness, and you were interacting with these things, well, then what does that say about the nature of reality at that point, right? Because this is the problem, is the hard problem.
Yeah, I think what the position I always come from is that we don't understand what consciousness is. We don't understand we don't know whether it is some uh, whether it emerges from neural activity, whether it's more fundamental, whether, as you suggest, the brain is more like a receiver of consciousness. We don't know the answer to that question. What we know, and which is what I always focus on, is that consciousness, that subjective consciousness has it has content and it has structure. And it's full of information. That's what I focus on. What is the information content of the experience, and how is that patterned and constructed by the cortex? So I'm not saying that the subjective nature of the world is constructed by the brain, but it's shaped. The content and the structure, the way that the experience is patterned and informed, is from neural activity. But it could well be that that's all the brain is doing, is it's shaping, receiving certain patterns. So just like a TV, one of those old TVs that had an aerial, it's receiving these patterns of radio waves, and then it has to use those to kind of construct the image. You don't say that the TV is or that the radio waves are emerging from the TV. It's quite the opposite. It's in the other direction, and it could be something like that. But we don't know, which is why I tend to avoid talking too much about what we don't know, or making judgments. So when people criticize me and say that I am an emergentist or a reductionist, or that I am assuming that the brain is responsible for the generation of consciousness, I'm really not. All I'm doing is taking what we know about subjective conscious experience, which is that it is full of content, it's information rich, it has structure, and that this structure is related to neural activity. We know that when we can explain at least the informational structure, the content of your subjective experience from neural activity. But that doesn't mean that neural activity is generating consciousness itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, let me ask you a question here. So a few years ago, I read a paper that was brought to my attention. It was a PubMed paper on the pineal gland, and now we know obviously DMT is produced in the brain and cerebral spinal fluid, not just in a specific gland or part of the brain. But in this, it talks about these little crystals that form within the pineal gland, hexagonal, cylindrical. There's all sorts of different shapes, and they produce, upon crushing or whatever, they produce an ultraviolet like effect. I guess my question would be, the paper talks about how it could possibly work in the same way that like the small bones in your ear, like otoconia, I think that's how you pronounce it, pick up vibrations. Could that be some sort of mechanism for the brain? Could there be something in the brain that's picking up vibrations and almost like a piezoelectric effect or something along those lines?
I think you'd have a hard time making that argument because, I mean, the pineal gland, obviously, it's become saturated with mysticism, that you can often lose sight of what the pineal gland, what we know the pineal gland is doing. I mean,
Right.
it's a gland. Obviously, it's producing this hormone melatonin. It's very, very small, size of the end of your little finger, and it's not the way that it's connected into your brain. Suggests that it's not the seat of consciousness, I would say. It's probably not big enough to producing large amounts of DMT. It is, of course, sensitive to light indirectly. in that.
What about in like because I know that's what Rick was studying before he actually started studying DMT. We've had him on a few times to talk about that. What if, though, my point was the pineal gland, not that it's causing consciousness in general, but what if it has placed some function in, like, let's say dreaming? We always wonder, like, what's dreaming? What if it's picking up some sort of, and you're in a sleep state or a meditative state, that then it's picking up something, and that's what's causing the dreams or something like that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think, again, it's you'd have to think about what's the mechanism here. So even if the pineal gland, these crystals within the pineal gland were able to pick up information from some electromagnetic or other source, how would that then feed into, how would that information connect into the rest of the cortex?
Right.
I don't know the answer is the question. I mean, it's something you could test. I mean, if someone really believes that, then...
Oh, I'm not testing. Nobody's going to let me test that. I'm just walk into a lab. Hey, I got these pineal crystals.
Right. So I think a lot of it comes to, and that's part of the problem, I guess, is that people are very willing to suggest, and people will often assert these things, and they will talk about decalcifying your pineal and make a lot of rather bold claims about what the pineal
a lot
doing.
of that stuff's woo-woo. That's
a
lot of that's nonsense.
So I think there's nothing wrong with having kind of wild ideas, but you have to at some point bring them down to earth, so to speak, and say, okay, let's think about how, first of all, what's the hypothesis here, how are we going to test it, and then let's test it, let's see what effect we expect it to have. And a lot of people don't do that, or don't have the ability to formulate the kind of hypothesis, or don't have that basic neuroscientific underpinning, that basic neuroscientific understanding to know what kind of experiments you should do with that. You get the same thing with people. Someone once wrote to me and said, is it that DMT is affecting the retina so that you can see other frequencies, right? That's often claimed, right? That DMT is allowing you to see outside of the narrow frequency range that our eyes can see. And my response to that is, well, if that's where these entities are, then we can pick them up with UV detectors, right? Or other detectors. We have equipment to detect outside of the visual range. So if these entities or beings or worlds were existing outside, literally outside of the visual frequency range, we should be able to detect them using other equipment, but we don't. You don't see.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that would fall under like psi research or something that like Dean Radin or somebody like that studies, because there's really nobody studying that kind of stuff out there. I know I mentioned this weird thing that I get when I'm in meditation, and I've talked to other people about it too, these lights, these flow. I don't know, it's hard to explain, and I asked Strassman about it, and he said maybe phosphenes or something like that, but I don't know. I don't know. I've talked to a lot of people that experience that, so maybe that is the case. I don't know enough about it. But...
Yeah, I mean, if you're seeing light, your brain doesn't need physical, actual light entering the eyes for you to perceive light. Obviously, when you spoke DMT, it's a very brightly lit space, but of course, there's no light entering the eyes. But as long as if you're activating certain parts of the visual cortex, then you will be seeing light. You will be seeing colors, and it will appear to be a very light-filled experience. But you don't need, the brain is in a dark box. It never has direct access to light. It only has access to those patterns of electrochemical signals that are entering the brain from the retina. But so you don't need light to experience light. You just need to activate those certain parts of the visual cortex that will give you the experience of light.
Another woo question.
Okay.
What about this sort of like these light retreats, or not like complete darkness retreats, where people are like locking themselves up for 6 days straight or whatever? There was some guy, Montauk Chia, or I forget the guy's name, he was on
Yeah,
one of
that's
those,
him.
like,
Yeah, I know him.
claiming that if you're in darkness long enough, your body starts to naturally produce DMT in these crazy states. The reason why I asked that is there's many accounts in the ancient world and esoteric texts of people retreating to a cave, and then, one specifically I can think of is Leonardo da Vinci, retreating to a cave and coming out some sort of ascended master. Not necessarily that they're being given some special knowledge or whatever, but maybe inducing some sort of endogenous psychedelic experience and then coming away with that. I could see that giving you an upper hand or an advantage over other people back then or something along those lines.
Yeah, I've spoken before about the possibility that, so the pineal gland, we could start there. The pineal gland obviously is activated by darkness, in that your pineal gland starts producing melatonin to go down, it becomes night. That's its kind of signal. So if big if the pineal was producing DMT, one might argue that extended periods in complete darkness would elevate DMT levels in the brain. But I don't think you have to necessarily invoke the pineal. There might be other mechanisms. If your brain is in a sensory deprived state, the brain doesn't like to be inactive. The brain is this is why people use sensory deprivation tanks, and will often have quite visionary experiences within them. When your brain is cut off from sensory information, then it can start to construct realities that are not mapped to the normal waking world, or not mapped to the environment in a normal way. And so I'm certainly open to the idea that extended periods in darkness might well induce visionary experiences that you couldn't experience easily, certainly if you didn't have access to kind of exogenous molecules. One can imagine, obviously it's not as efficient and takes a long time, and to some extent it's quite dramatic, but going into a dark cave for weeks on end and cutting yourself from all sources of light, that would probably induce some kind of visionary experience. And you can think about cave art, ancient cave art. I've often thought about whether the reason they were painted on these completely inaccessible, hidden areas of the earth, they're not painted on the walls outside in the open where people can look at them and see how beautiful they are. For some reason, they were painting them deep down in the earth. And there might be a number of explanations for that, anthropological explanations that I don't know about. But it's also possible that they were in there because it induced this kind of visionary state in this dark, in pure darkness.
Well,
And,
they tell us in some of them, the Tassil Agir, the bee shaman, Terence McKenna's famous bee shaman from Algeria, from Food of the Gods, and then you have Salva Pascuala, Spain, 6000 BC roughly. Psilocybe hispanica clearly depicted next to a bowl. So while they're showing you that they're taking these mushrooms, it's not necessarily endogenous. We know that they're obviously trying to tell you something. Hey, we know about this. We know.
Yeah. I think that using these molecules in combination with darkness can certainly be a very powerful technique. If you want to really enhance and eliminate the external sources of visual sensory information, then going into a dark place and taking mushrooms would be a very good idea. It's a good way to have a very profound experience, I think, but not recommended for beginners.
Yeah, I saw that Aubrey Marcus guy did some sort of darkness retreat, and now he's got Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback, doing it. And Aaron Rodgers said he's not gonna figure out his future until he does this this darkness retreat. So I don't know. We'll see if this dude flips out or what. But I remember in high school, actually, some weird kid we went to school with told Maurice, you want to really flip out? He's like, your parents go away for the weekend, lock yourself in the car. He's like, you'll really freak out. And this kid apparently locked himself in the car for a weekend and had a totally psychedelic experience. So
there you go. You see, there's more than one way to skin a cat, as they say. Yeah.
Before we wrap it up here, I did want to ask you one more thing, which is, have you heard of Dr. Stephen Barker? I know this guy, John Chavez, who runs DMT Quest channel. did that documentary, the DMT Quest documentary, and in there they're talking about all the latest, rat studies and mice studies from U of M, and how they found DMT in the brain and cerebral spinal fluid, all that kind of stuff. But then there was a study apparently at LSU by Stephen Barker, which indicates that maybe DMT is the precursor to all psychedelics, and that all the different psychedelic, whether it's serotonergic or whatever, play off of the DMT enzymes or whatever. That is actually, let's say it's psilocybin or whatever, it's all getting broken down, funneled towards, and I'm probably butchering his hypothesis a little bit here, but the idea that DMT is actually at the root of all of these compounds and experiences.
So is saying that when you take psilocybin, it's converted to DMT.
Yeah, like tryptamines are all broken down into the same thing.
Okay. I mean, yeah, it depends on the metabolic route. I mean, certainly DMT might have an inactive metabolic product that is shared with psilocybin, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that the DMT was just responsible for the effects of psilocybin. However, if psilocybin was converted in vivo inside the body to DMT, then that would potentially be responsible for some of the effects. But I think the biochemically, I'd have to read the paper. I'm ashamed to say I've not read that paper, so I can't tell you exactly what he was getting at. I mean, he's an analytical chemist, Stephen Barker, so he's very good with analyzing the concentrations and teasing apart the molecular constituents of plants and other kind of chemical mixtures. I'm not sure that he's a neuroscientist as such, but if you're interested in the kind of the metabolism of these molecules, he's certainly the one to ask. So he'd probably know better than I would. But I think converting psilocin, which is the active component of mushrooms, so psilocybin is converted, dephosphorylated to psilocin. So to get to DMT, you then have to remove this oxygen, this hydroxyl group from the
Isn't
phenol.
silicon's one molecule away, right? All you have to do is, like, as you just mentioned.
Yes. So psilocin, to get some psilocin to DMT, so psilocin is 4-hydroxy DMT. So to get from psilocin to DMT, you need to remove that oxygen, which is not actually a normal process in the human body. Normally, what you would do is you'd attach something else to the hydroxyl and make it more water soluble. So I'd be surprised, very surprised, if psilocin was being converted to DMT in the body. And of course, that could never work with something LSD, which certainly, it has a much more complex ring structure. That's certainly not going to be converted to DMT. So I don't think we can say that DMT is responsible for the effects of LSD and all the other molecules. I think they all have.
Again, I'd have
they
to
all
read.
work by the same mechanism. Yeah, they all work by the same mechanism broadly, and that they're all binding to the same kind of receptor sites, but they all work in a slightly different way.
All right. Well, yeah, let's wrap it up here. I did want to ask you one more thing, and I'm trying to think. It was just a basic. Maybe. Oh, I know what it was. Have you ever heard of Inocebi aerugruescens?
Originations, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Inocebi originations. I always fluff the.
It's a crazy word, right?
Best I can do. Yeah, crazy. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah, this is one of the mushrooms that contains very high concentrations of this originacin. People always tell me how it's pronounced. I always forget. But anyway, originacin maybe, which is this trimethylated version of psilocin, of psilocybin, but it probably doesn't get into the brain, I don't think. With those 3 methyl group, it has a positive charge on the nitrogen.
Yeah, because the paper I read was talking about how it could be like the CBD to THC, but for the psilocybin realm, where it could enhance or have an entourage effect or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a post on my Substack, 3-part post articles on the so-called entourage effect in mushrooms, and originacin is It's probably, if there is a CBD type element, something that's more bodily, something that's more outside the brain, that has effect on the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, rather than the central nervous system. I think that originating would be the molecule there, because it does seem to me, looking at its structure, that it would have a very hard time getting into the brain and working in the same way that psilocin or DMT does. So yeah, I think I've never consumed that particular variety of mushroom, so I can't tell you what it feels like.
Yeah, I'm interested. I want to try it for sure. All right, well, one more question from a fan. We got one person hanging around. Donnie Brasco. He says, let's see here. Have you heard of the new molecule they discovered by adding freebase DMT to magic mushrooms as they grow? It says if you feed psilocybe mushrooms 5-MeO DMT, or if you feed psilocybe mushrooms 5-MeO DMT, they will convert to 5-HO 5-MeO DMT. What about that?
Yeah, so this is, again, I wrote a Twitter thread on this. So this is silomethoxin is what they call it. So it's like the molecular combination of 5-MeO with psilocin. So 5-MeO DMT has a 5-methoxy group on the ring. It's a ring of a methoxy group on the 5 position. Psilocin has a hydroxyl group on the 4 position. Yeah. So when you put them both together, you get 4-hydroxy 5-methoxy DMT, which you can get by feeding, as they say, if you feed 5-MeO to these mushrooms, they will add that hydroxyl group in that 4 position, which is what they do. They have the enzymes for that. So then you get this silomethoxin molecule, which, there's like a church of silomethoxin that's established themselves, and apparently they have very wonderful experiences with it. I've never tried it. There is a small possible risk when you have these 2 oxygen bearing groups at that position on the ring. We know that that they can be neurotoxic. So the 4-5 hydroxyl variant is known to be neurotoxic and is used to actually cause lesions in experimental animals' brains. But there's no evidence that this silomethoxin has the same neurotoxicity, because that has this methyl group. So it's 5-methoxy, not 5-hydroxy. So it's probably fine, but we just don't know. Whether I'm keen to try it, I'm not sure. I mean, nature has provided.
I know you're still down to try that Salvinorin B methoxy or methoxy ether, whatever that is, that extended state.
Oh God, that's a while ago now. Yeah, I should probably write about that. I might make a post on that. Yeah, that's really cool. It lasts like Salvinorin, but lasts for like hours and hours.
Yeah, because we were talking about that the last time you were on. We were talking about smoking salvia versus chewing the quids, and how you were talking about how the lingual contact reinitiates the experience as opposed to smoking it once and flipping out. So
yeah.
Well, listen, man. Always fun having you on. You're a wealth of knowledge. I love just asking you random questions I've been wondering about, because you actually study this stuff. So you are, of course, welcome on anytime. Please go buy Reality Switch Technologies. This thing's thick. It's juicy. It's an amazing, it's an amazing book if you're curious on all the mechanisms and all the different receptors and the way that these things play off of our own consciousness and how they could be used to induce these states. Check that out. Also, this one, Alien Information Theory. Again, you see all the stuff happening out there with balloons and UFOs and stuff like that. Go make contact tonight, folks. Read this book. So, but yeah, you can check out all of Andrew's links down below at alieninsect.com. Check out his Substack. He's a wonderful follow on Twitter at alieninsect. And I have all the links down below. If you want to support Mind Escape, all you have to do is click the LinkTree link down below. We have all of our stuff on there, merch store. I have a new shirt where we're going to donate all the proceeds to charity. Chris Wolford said something the other day. He said, "Forget the balloons." So I put a "forget the balloons" in quotation marks with a flying saucer below it. Yeah, we've got our documentary coming out. It's going to be premiering at the Roswell UFO Expo right now online at ufoexpo.com. We will premiering our documentary the 10th. I think it's actually on the 11th is when we're premiering it, which is Saturday. And Andrew is actually a big part of the documentary. Our documentary is called As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT. And he will be a big portion of the DMT part as well as some of the crossover, because let's face it, there's a lot of weirdness happening in these realms. So, anything else? Oh, yeah, check out our other podcast, the Roswell UFO Symposium. I do it with Shane, who was on here earlier, and our other buddy Toby, who's currently in the ER. He got bit by some sort of weird bug or scorpion, so hopefully you're feeling better out there, Toby. And, yeah, I'm just trying to think if there's anything else here. Oh, new logo. Shout out to Aubrey. Thank you so much for the new logo. I love it. And if anybody needs any sort of creative work, whether it be a logo or animation or anything like that, please check out Aubrey's links. I will add it down below. And again, thank you so much, Andrew. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to what you put out next. And yeah, let us know if you need anything. You are always welcome on the show.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'll see you again.
Yeah, maybe Maurice will be back next time. He's currently editing. I've got him in the talking about Elves. I've got little Maurice in the workshop editing our documentary. So, all right, I'm going to play our documentary trailer as we leave. And again, we love everybody. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.
Is it real or is it not? That's what you're asking me.
I still, to this day, can't find any rational explanation for what I saw.
Extremely intelligent, apparently highly advanced, hyper-technological being.
I think that we just don't look at the perception of reality in the right way yet.
It got very close to the point that I could see just one big light, and then it stopped, and then it shot up in the sky.
You know you're not dreaming, but you wonder how real any of it really is.
It dawned on me, it was real. This took place, but then I still didn't do anything with it. Never said anything to anybody.
There is some mind-altering aspect to these UFO encounters. A lot of people get a sense of missing time.
I noticed that these three stars were kind of in a formation. It was a triangular formation.
Condensed into entities or beings that you interact with who are sentient.
The chemicals which are going into our brain are making the unconscious archetypes come alive.
How things evolve from pure energy to matter.
Definitely was kind of a paradigm shifting moment.
And as we continue to evolve in our own consciousness, we will perceive of new modes of interpretation, but that may be dependent upon how this supposed phenomenon reveals itself to us.
I'm not sure why we discredit the human experience when it's not in alignment with our current belief system.
It's important to consider that, one, we don't really understand what our minds do under the influence of psychedelics.
They all attest to the reality of some other realm. You call it the paranormal, doesn't matter what you call it, spiritual realm, supernatural, metaphysical, doesn't matter.
The fact that we're essentially vibrating energy in a sense, and that when this experience is over, that particular energy transforms and doesn't die because it can't die, fills me with a lot of comfort that there is something else after this so-called here and now.
They show you how much of your reality is subjective and fragile and capable of being influenced by a psychedelic drug.
Coming from a scientific background, you come up with explanations that range from geomagnetic to atmospheric to something that's physical in nature.
There's a lot more out there that we don't know than we do know.
So the entire system, the human body, is effectively a stimulation response machine.
I think something's here. I don't know what it is. I don't know where it's from. It could be extraterrestrials.
Until it made a full rotation and then it just hit an insane speed and just shot up straight into the atmosphere.
I think that there's compelling evidence that psychedelics have played a significant role in human evolution over a long period of time.
That our view of reality, the reality that we experience on a day-to-day basis, seems to be this very, very thin slice of something far larger and far more complex. For reasons that we're never clear about. Never said
As within, so without. From UFOs to DMT.